about to start. We'll talk about code or whatever we'll talk about today. It's about to start, so please hang tight while I check that everything is okay. Sound check, camera check, lights check. How's my hair? Oh, wait, I don't have any hair. Maybe put some pants on and I am good to go. So get ready wherever you are, 'cause this stream is about to start. Get ready wherever you are, 'cause this stream is about to start. Hello everyone, my name is Leandro Facchinetti and let's write some code together, shall we? What we have on the menu today is to take a step back, revisit some of the implementation decisions we made while starting sketching the new version of the Automixer, and perhaps improve on things. Perhaps. We will try to improve on things. It's always like that. You start developing a bunch of things, then you take a step back, you realize that some patterns exist, and you try to extract some abstractions, and then the code base improves and you're able to implement yet more features and that kind of thing. So before we dive into the main topic, let me say hey to Mage. Hey Mage, great to have you here. Thanks for joining us early. And the one thing that bugs me the most about the implementation of the Automixer right now, the thing that we'll try to address in this session, is the way that we deal with what I'm calling the group-wide parameters. Those are parameters that apply to every plugin instance in the group. And in case you don't know much about the Automixer and what we have been doing here on this channel, we are coding live a bunch of real-time audio processors using the JSFX language in REAPER. And for this session, I don't think you will need to know in depth what the Automixer is about. A high-level explanation is just that it is an effect that helps you tame bleed and crosstalk when you have some kind of roundtable interview, live events where you would have multiple microphones open in the same space. And when someone is speaking, their voice is picked up by their microphone, but there is also some bleed into everyone else's microphone, and the Automixer helps with that. But anyway, let's take a look at what these group-wide parameters are doing. Here we have a project using the Automixer. It needs to be inserted into each track, so each microphone will receive its own instance of the Automixer plugin. And then we have this notion of groups that is useful if you have perhaps like 5 microphones in one room with 5 people, and then there is a Skype connection to another room with 3 more people, and you would like to auto-mix these groups independently because maybe they don't have any crosstalk between them since they are in different rooms. And you can do that setting up different groups. Right now, these 2 instances are on the same group, group 1. But I'm going to leave this third instance into group 2, just so we can see what I mean by the group-wide parameters. So these are the group-wide parameters right here, up to this one, or actually up to this one. Yes. So what happens is when you are switching these sliders around, you are moving them around, all the sliders in the plugin instances of the same group need to move with. It doesn't matter which instance you choose to use the slider in, they all are in sync. And importantly, the instances that are not in the same group are not in sync. So it may seem as though these are group parameters. It may seem as though this is a kind of a concept that exists in JSFX, but it's not. We are creating that with some code, and that's the code that I want to improve today. So there is a way for the different plugin instances to communicate and coordinate and communicate that, yeah, hey, this slider has changed, change it on your side as well. But the truth of the matter is that each plugin instance will have its own set of sliders. It's just that we are syncing them. I guess in a way it is similar to a native REAPER feature called parameter linking. But we are implementing that as a first class concept in this plugin, and parameter linking would not have the notion of groups, for instance. So it makes sense that we are refining this concept in this plugin. Now let's take a moment to learn how this is currently implemented, and then I will try to go over an idea that perhaps we will improve on this. Yes, the GMem stuff looks like a real code smell spread all over a whole lot. Refactor day, exactly. And Bo is also here. Hello, Bo. Great to have you here. And yeah, I guess the biggest problem I have with this is that there is some repetition. That's the biggest problem I have with the code that we are about to look at. There is repetition in that code. And the second problem I have with that code is that in order to add one group-wide slider, you have to touch, I think, 4 points of the code base. And the way that I tend to do that is I just search for another group-wide parameter, and I go to all the places where that occurs, and then I change, which is not ideal. Perhaps we will be able to find an abstraction for that. It is refactor day. Let's get to it. So as I explained before, these group-wide parameters are regular sliders from a JSFX perspective. We are doing some fancy things to sync these sliders across the plugin instances, but they are just good old sliders. And then there is some stuff happening on the init block that only runs once. When the plugin is loaded the first time, this will run, and then it won't be run again. And over here, what we do is we set this data structure that is used to communicate between plugin instances. So you can see, for instance, that the window length is a slider. The RMS window length is a slider. And this is the corresponding field in the data structure used to communicate between the plugin instances. So we have this gmem space that is a global memory space accessible by all the plugin instances. And they are going to say, oh, hey, I have a new value for RMS window length. And then all the other plugin instances will see, oh, there is a new value for RMS window length. Let me update my own slider. So this is going to be the channel of communication between plugin instances. But this is just the definition of the data structure. It is just saying at which index you will find the different pieces of data. It is not an instance of a data structure. It is just the definition of the data structure. Then we allocate some space for the data structure, that is this line. Nothing terribly interesting happening there. Then we have this, and if we can get rid of this, I would love it. I'm not sure we will be able to. We'll see about that. But this is something that really bugs me. What's happening here is we use this channel, this global memory, as a channel of communication between plugin instances. But what happens the first time you load the plugin? The first time you load the first instance of the plugin? In that case, the global namespace, this global channel of communication, is not initialized. There is just a bunch of zeros there. That's what exists in memory by default when you are using JSFX. If you have a variable name, a chunk of memory, whatever the case may be, that you haven't used before, it starts as a 0. So what we do is we initialize those places in memory with the default values. This is sort of repeating this information that we have here, for instance. That's the default window length. And we have to do this here, because if we don't, then we wouldn't have a way of distinguishing, not with this current architecture anyway, we wouldn't have a way of distinguishing, oh, this value in memory is 0 because it hasn't been initialized yet. We wouldn't be able to distinguish that scenario from the scenario of, oh, the user has just updated the slider and now the value is 0. I guess in this case, it's not an allowed value, but in other sliders that is an allowed value. So you could have a 0 there. So we don't have a way of distinguishing uninitialized from having just been modified. So if we don't have these lines, what happens is we treat this uninitialized memory as a change to a slider, as if there is a ghost plugin instance setting all the sliders to 0. And then we end up loading the first instance of the plugin. It starts up as all the values being 0 instead of being the defaults. I don't like these lines because they require me to repeat the defaults. I have to create these variables with information that is repeated. This 300, for instance, is here, but it was also there. I don't like that. And I think that in general, just this whole notion is not super clean. We should be able to find a way to distinguish the scenario of memory hasn't been initialized yet from the scenario of the user has just changed the slider and that's why memory looks different. We should be able to come up with a solution for this. I don't know what the solution is going to be yet. We should be able to find one though. Complex systems should be allowed to grow organically, driven by need. It's no use trying to design it up front. You are at the perfect point for this today. I think so too. From a feature perspective, there is a lot more that I want to do in terms of user interface. But in terms of processing the sound, I think we are in a good place. In fact, we didn't do much beyond the original implementation of my Automixer. We fixed a bug here and there in terms of look ahead mainly, but the audio processing is pretty much okay. My main concern moving forward is, I guess, finishing the things that we started. For instance, the Automixer for video using the OBS integration is not fully fleshed out, but there is a lot of structure that is already in place and kind of working. So user interface, features that we started and didn't finish, but almost everything is in place. We know how the pieces are going to look like. So that's why I'm trying to take a step back now and try to come up with a better structure for this. That is, I wouldn't say that these group parameters are like the most important part of the Automixer, but they're definitely a part of the code base that annoy me the most. So that's why I wanted to focus on this. Right. So then, after having initialized the global namespace, oh, and notice that there is a conditional here, which is another thing that I don't actually like. We must do this initialization only for the first instance of the plugin that is loaded. Because if you keep doing this initialization, anytime you add an instance of the Automixer to a project, it is going to reset the sliders on all other instances. Let's take a moment to actually see this again. We saw this as I was developing the thing during the previous live streams, but let's see this again. So if I don't have any of this, what happens is I add an instance of the Automixer, and if I don't have that kind of code, all the sliders will be set to 0. Well, they are not, because the global memory is still available, probably because of this Automixer instance that was reading from the same namespace. So now they're all 0. And if I have this code, but I don't have this condition, in other words, I'm always initializing stuff, then I will add an Automixer instance and it has the default values. That's great. And then I change from the default values. And as I add another instance, perhaps if I add it from scratch, not having copy and pasted this instance, yeah, then they all snap back to default. If I drag and drop the instance, it carries the sliders with it. So then this init block is not going to run, I guess. It is kind of odd. If you copy and paste the instance, I don't think that the init block ran, because otherwise this would have run and reset. But anyway, if you just go into the effects menu and add an Automixer, that code is going to run and then reset the global namespace when it shouldn't. So that's why we check that we are the first instance. And we do have this internal counter that we need for other purposes, not only for syncing global parameters, but also for communicating the loudness of the different tracks and actually do the auto mixing. We need to have this way of registering tracks or registering plugin instances, so they all get their own ID, which is just a sequence of numbers, and we check that we are the first, which is actually a race condition. So that's another reason to dislike this, because if there are two instances, well, I guess if there are two instances running this kind of code at the same time, and they end up with the same ID, you have bigger problems than just this, but this is yet another problem. All right, so moving forward, this has nothing to do with the syncing of the global parameters. Neither does this. That doesn't have to do with that. And then we have this. What we are doing here is we are reading from the global memory. So if it is the first plugin that is loaded, we are writing to the global memory. But in all cases, we are reading from the global memory. And the purpose of this is if you have one instance with some custom sliders already set, and you load a new instance in the same group, we load those values from memory to adjust the sliders. Let's see this in action. So if I comment this out, what I expect to happen is for the first instance to customize some values, and then when I bring in a second instance, it will not have the right values. Oh, it's resetting the values to default? That's not what I was expecting, I don't think. Oh, right, I think I see what's happening. If I don't have this code, then the sliders will load as the defaults, but we will have further code below that will read this and think, oh, the user has just changed the slider. Of course, that's not true. The user has not changed the slider, but it will think that the user has changed the slider and changed the global memory. So those lines are necessary. Let's repeat the exercise with the lines in place and see the behavior. So if I change some sliders around and I load a new instance from scratch, then the new instance also has the right sliders. there is one thing that stands out to me. This code is related to this code, but it's not near that code. There were other things that were not related in between. I wonder if there is any kind of dependency between these variables and these variables, because if there are no dependencies between these two blocks, then it means they can be reordered, and at least reordering this is already an improvement. It is a trivial refactoring, I guess, but it is already improvement. So let's see. And the way that I'm going to check this is I'm going to select variables, and when I do that, Visual Studio Code is going to highlight all the occurrences of the variables. And if there is an occurrence down here, it means that this block depends on that block. But I'm fairly certain that this will not be the case. All right. So now at least these two blocks that are super related are near one another. Let's, for a moment, review that we didn't break anything. So I changed sliders, I add a new instance from scratch, and the new instance comes with the values correctly, and they are still in sync and everything. That's perfect. Dale is here. Hello. Great to see you here. If you have ideas, you may have some ideas. If you have ideas on how to improve on this, let me know. Okay, so this is the place where we left off. Then these things have nothing to do with syncing of the group parameters, so we can skip that. Then this slider section is quite interesting. When I said that there is code that is repeated, like copy and pasted, this is one of the two places where there is copy and paste. And what happens here is, if you are changing a slider, you're changing one of the sliders, but it is not the case that you're changing from one group to the other. Because if you're changing groups, then what we should be doing is loading the parameters, the sliders, from the other group. Like this. See, group 2 has the default values, group 1 has these values. So if we are changing this slider, we should not be syncing stuff. In fact, we should be receiving values from the other instances. And that's what we are checking here. We are checking that we changed a slider, and that's why this block is running, but the slider that we changed is not this one. And the way we do that is a bit clumsy. We keep track of the previous group. Yeah, we have to have that here, and we have to have that there. And we keep track of the previous group. And we check if the group right now, this is the value of the slider, is equal to the previous group. It's kind of clumsy. I don't like the way that this works. I think that the thing I wish for is something that does not exist in JSFX. I think that the best way to express this idea is for when you're running this block of code, the slider section, I would like for it to be able to tell me what is the slider that caused this block to run. What is the slider that changed? As far as I understand, this section is going to be called on every slider that changes. And if there are multiple sliders changing at the same time, because perhaps you are automating stuff, I think that this will be called once per slider change. Not sure about this. It may be called only once per block, for instance, for all the sliders that have changed. but I tend to conceptualize this as a block of code that runs anytime you change any slider. But you have no straightforward way of knowing which slider. You have to check, so you have to keep track of the previous value, compare with a new value, see if something has changed for that slider, and react accordingly. So it is always possible to know which slider has changed. It's just that you have to do all the work yourself. So what happens here is we know that we changed a slider, and we know by this whole check that I just explained that the slider that has changed is not this first one. So it could be one of these sliders down here that are specific to the instance. You can see that when I change the priority, the other priorities don't change automatically because they are not group-wide parameters. But it could be that you changed a group-wide parameter. And if you did that, then it's time for us to update the global memory for the other instances to know about the change we just made. And this is what we are doing here. We are writing to that global space in memory. Not only we are doing that, but we are also computing some some derived values. For instance, and probably this is the most straightforward example. If you change the look ahead length, then that's given in milliseconds on the slider. But in the plugin, we will need that value in terms of samples. So we convert to milliseconds. We convert from milliseconds to samples. And like that, there are several derived values, things that need to occur anytime you change a slider. So you can think of this as like the coefficients on a filter is something that you would need to recompute anytime that the filter cutoff frequency changes, for instance. And like that, there are many derived values. And I think that having to have this in two places is troublesome. You are bound to forget one place, update one, forget the other, and then your plugin misbehaves. But we don't need to look at the specifics of each derived value. I was careful enough to separate this in paragraphs. So each paragraph starts with the parameter that has changed, and then the next lines, the next phrases on the paragraph are the derived values. So I guess one thing that we may try to do is to extract this stuff into a function and extract this stuff into something else. But we are going to perhaps tease these two apart. Right now, the paragraphs read parameter derived values, parameter derived values, parameter derived values. Perhaps we can tease these apart and organize these as parameters. And then derived values. And the advantage of doing it that way is we can define a function for this, and we can call this function from multiple places. And then we are avoiding the repetition of code. All right, so this is another place where we need to keep track of things. I guess so we can navigate around the code base more easily. I think what I'm going to do is mark the places where we know we want to touch. So I think that this data structure is not something that we will want to touch. I'm pretty happy about the way that this works, and even the way that this works. Pretty happy with that way we established a channel of communication, and there is very little repetition when it comes to this. So I'm happy with that. But this is something that I would like to perhaps avoid. So I will leave myself a fix me here. I don't think I'm using fix me anywhere else. Well, I am, so I'll just say here because I don't think I'm using the word here anywhere else. Well, I am. I will use the word banana because I don't think I'm using the word banana anywhere else. There we go. So we will be looking for bananas later. So there is this section that at least is just one compact section now instead of being two sections. Then we have this, which is another banana that we will have to keep track of. And the third and final banana is this. So while this was running, as soon as we change a slider in order to write to the global memory for other instances to pick up, here we are on the other end. We are an instance that is receiving new slider information from the global namespace. And the way that this works out is we, again, have to check if something has changed. So we check that the value that we have is different from the value that the global namespace has. And then, of course, we have to assume that we are wrong. So we update ourselves. And then this line is the exact opposite of that one. While this one is writing to the global memory, this one is reading from the global memory. And lo and behold, here is a derived value again that we have to recompute like that. I wonder why this is not there. Oh, this isn't there because this is not us writing to the global memory to sync sliders. This is something else. Yeah, all of these are writing into groups, and that is not writing into groups, that's writing into tracks. I think that what this line is doing is it is communicating to the global namespace which group we belong to, we being one instance. This line is not like the others, and I think that this is actually a bug. Let's think this through. The plugin instances need to communicate not only for syncing global parameters or for syncing group parameters, but they also need to communicate to do the actual automixing. And for that, they need to compute the loudness of their microphone, and they need to communicate that loudness or that RMS value to the global namespace, a different part of that namespace, but global nevertheless, so that all the other instances in the same group can look at it and see, oh, okay, I need to attenuate myself because that other microphone was louder than me. And that means that all instances need to communicate their own group that they belong to all other instances so that they can check. When the other instance is computing, they need to know which tracks to take in account. So I think I can devise a test for this real quick, but something that stands out to me is that you are trying to update the global memory with the new group information if the group is the same. If you have not changed the group, then you communicate the group. That must be wrong, right? That must be wrong. Let's see if we can actually observe the problem. I have here a test setup where one track is my microphone and another track is a tone generator, and we can see the tone generator bouncing up and down as I speak to make space for my voice. And as soon as I change this group, we should see the thing flatlining and we should see this stop bouncing, and we do. but we just changed the slider and this group was not equal to the previous group. So this block of code must not have run. Is there any other place where we write this? No, there is no other place where we write this. So how come the other instance knows that they should avoid this instance? Does it really know? Let's do the setup again and I will change the other track. I changed the tone generator track. I will try to put myself, my voice, out of the mix, out of the group. And oh, so there you go. I put my own voice out of the group and it is flatlining because it considers itself in group 2. But the sine wave is still considering myself in group 1. So it's still bouncing up and down. It shouldn't be. The fix is really simple. This is a variable that is safe to write to every time. So with this simple change of taking that line out of the conditional, let's do the same setup where I have 2 tracks. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my voice out of the group and it flatlines, but the tone generator also stops bouncing because now the tone generator knows that we are off of that group. Perfect. I thought we would be refactoring. Here we are fixing bugs. Yeah, right. Okay, and this last line is not part of the banana group here. Because this last line is not syncing global parameters or group parameters. Okay, so we only have 2 bananas to think about. Or 3. We only have 3 bananas to think about. We have 1 banana on the init section, 1 in the slider section, and 1 in the block section. You know what? Even if we are not able to get rid of the bananas here, I'm already happy that we are doing this exercise because we found a bug and we made this better. Very happy with the changes so far. It is bananas. What's great about bananas is that it is a relatively recent word, so it's kind of the same in every language. Let me test this assumption. I think that it is the same in English and Portuguese. I think it's the same in French, but is it the same in Swedish, for instance? Bo, what do you have to say? Is it bananas? Okay. Let's try to paint a picture of what's going on here, because it's hard to keep track of everything when I keep drawing stuff with my hands in the air. So instead, let's try to draw this on paper. Also, because I again changed my setup for the secondary camera. Now it should be lag-free, but no overlays like on yesterday's stream. So I'm putting this to test. Let's see if it can keep up. I'm back to using OBS camera. And for the last time, I swear, if OBS camera fails me now, I'm giving up on this thing. We have the sliders. We have gmem. We have the derived fields. I think that these are the 3 main actors the sliders, gmem, and derived fields. The way that this currently works is the sliders write to gmem when they have been changed, but they also read from gmem. So this happens in the slider block, and this happens on the block section of code. The derived fields are recomputed in the slider section, but they are also recomputed in the block section. So I guess let's start by trying that refactoring that I mentioned, where we don't copy and paste code in these two sections. We have a function that will be called in these two sections. This is just a bunch of cut and paste, but it is a bit of a re-architecture. I think that this will be good. Let's give it a try. It's banan in Dutch, and I think pisang in Indonesian. Do you speak Indonesian? That's amazing. My favorite Dutch word is windmolen. I only caught half of that. Banana is banan in Swedish. So see, it is a relatively modern word, like chocolate, so it's almost the same everywhere. We do use a lot of English phrases though, so such as bananas plus various others that would shut down the stream. Yeah, so there you go. Banana is easy to say, and it is almost the same in every language. Cool word. Also my favorite fruit, incidentally. People say that we are comparing apples to apples or apples to oranges, I guess. But if you are comparing apples to bananas, I mean, you can peel and the thing is already clean. You don't have to wash it, and it tastes much better. It's great with chocolate, incidentally. So bananas all the way. When it comes to defining functions, as far as I know, you can define the function anywhere. And in most situations, people tend to define functions in the init section because it makes more sense. And if you're doing something like a library, it only makes sense to put functions in the init section because the other sections are not going to run when you're importing a library. But in this case, I think I'm going to open an exception to this. Because I think that even though everyone is following this convention, or most people are following this convention of defining functions in a init section, I think that they are allowed anywhere. And I think that in this case, it makes more sense to define this function here. And I think I will call this function slider. I think I can do that. So all I'm gonna do is extract these derived fields and put them here. Before I start, do I have any pending changes? No. Okay. So there is one thing that I don't like about this refactoring that we are starting. To reiterate, the thing that I do like is that we will get rid of repetition because this code exists in two places. But what I don't like is that it's not immediately obvious what this derived field is computed from. You have to look at the right-hand side of the equal sign. You have to find the thing. You have to look it up. While in this version, it was very evident what was dependent on what. So it's always a trade-off, but I think in this case, it's well worth it. And after having done all of this, it is always safe to call the slider function. Even if we changed groups, even if whatever the case may be, after having synced all this, it's always safe to call the slider function. So perhaps this function definition could live a little bit closer to the first call to it. Yeah, I think I like it that way. I really like how this makes all the gmem manipulation, all the gmem management clustered together. And then all the derived field computation clustered together. And derived fields tend to be the thing you do in the slider section anyway. So it makes sense that this lives here. So now we can deal with the need to call the slider function from down here. So I guess I'm going to follow one idea that Dale gave us many streams back. But it goes like this: needs to call slider. Or I guess just needs slider. Needs to call slider. It starts being false. And then anytime you want to compute a derived field, we say that now you need to call slider. And the reason why we want to do this guard in check and do this guard and also check is to avoid doing work, because we are in the block section. So this is going to run often. It is in the audio thread. We want to avoid any computation that is not strictly necessary within reason. We have one instance of this. No, not that one though. We have here and here. And we have one more. Here we have three places where there are sliders that don't have any derived field. So in that case, we don't need to check. I think that checking this is more expensive than just letting this line run every time, and it is of no consequence to run this line every time. So I'm going to rewrite this. And then the pattern that is emerging is we just update the slider values, but we check that if it needs to compute derived values, we do this bit as well. So I guess one way we could do this is hang on, hold that thought. Let's finish what we started. This needs to call slider at the end after all the parameters have been updated. You need to check for that and actually call slider. Oh, there is no underscore dot in this name. It's just slider. Okay, let's see if the thing we did actually works. Pindacas? Is that a word for dick? My favorite Dutch treat, way better than any other peanut butter I've tried. Yeah, but you know what's great with bananas? Nutella. Nutella is great with bananas. Of course, I don't actually get Nutella, the brand, because that one has milk. But there are plenty of excellent vegan versions of that. I had pindacas on my bread today. I haven't eaten a banana though, but I am currently eating an apple. Are you team apple? Come on. Pindacas plus banana on bread is a treat. I hate that the function delimiter are parentheses and not curly braces. So what Mage is talking about is the fact that not only you have to use parentheses to delimit the parameters that are passed to a function, but you also use parentheses to delimit blocks of code. It is unusual. I cannot remember any other language that works like this. It is unusual. Usually it would be parentheses for function parameters and braces for blocks of code. And in some languages, it would be keywords for blocks of code. But, you know, it doesn't bother me so much. It doesn't bother me. I don't think I have many complaints about the syntax of JSFX. There are these things, like I mentioned, I would love to be able to, for instance, ask about the default value of a slider. But that's not the language. It is more like the standard library. I guess there would be some kind of function that you call with a slider and it would provide you with the default. So I don't think I have a lot of complaints about the language itself. I think it works very well, and I am not bothered by the parentheses versus braces. I'm okay with that. Okay, let's see if I broke something. And the test is going to start really simple. I will just have 2 instances and let's see if I am still syncing stuff. And I am. Great. Let's commit what we have and we will proceed finding the commonalities between these blocks of code. Then, okay, the next step I want to take is this. So if these are okay to run every time, then it's also okay to run all of these lines I'm selecting. The trick is just that we need to do this. We specifically need to put these lines after those ones, not before. If we put the lines before, it will not work because then we will have already updated this before we try to check for the difference. So we need to do this in this order specifically. And this is making things a bit worse because I am, in terms of performance, it's making things a bit worse because now I'm running this operation every time, not behind a conditional. But I think we are about to do something that is going to improve at least the readability, if not the performance. By the way, how are we doing in terms of performance? How much CPU is this taking? Well, it's taking a fair bit, 0.3% per instance, but it's not terrible. Let's see if that latest development broke anything. No, still syncing. I'm building up to something, trust me. You can probably see what I'm building up to at this point. But now that we have this out of the conditionals, we can clump all of these together. But again, remember, we must do these updates after these checks. Like so. So the reason why I wanted to extract these guys from the conditionals was so that I could clump all of them together, because now we have lines that pretty much mimic these ones. And I think that that's an improvement. Again, we haven't improved in terms of performance, but I think we improved in terms of expressiveness. I'm not going to bother with checking because I just reordered some stuff. And that's how you introduce bugs. But now, check this out. For the next trick, check how I'm doing a bunch of conditionals just to set this variable that needs to call slider variable. So what we can do is just extract this, all of them, like so, into here. Yucky. There is no way to make this look pretty. I don't think there is any way to make this look pretty, but hey, now this turned into something much more compact. What do we say here? Perhaps have this notion of global parameters in the library. That's still a good idea, and I think we are working towards that. Is there an issue with a race condition if the person writes automation to these sliders? This is a good question. I think I will keep both of these around. But it's much shorter now. Let's see if we didn't break anything. Yeah, we are still syncing. And we need to check this first because we're about to update things, but we need to call this function last. We cannot call the slider function up top because it will not have the latest values that came from these lines. So these lines need to occur before this one because it will use variables such as this that will be updated there. So there is a strict order. We need to do this check first because we are about to rewrite, but we need to actually call the function last. Okay. And I can see something else that bothers me. We are accessing gmem twice. The first is here and the second is there. And the reason we do this is that first we need to check that the parameter has changed, and then we need to check it again to update the parameter. I can see one way of fixing this, and that's to have a bunch of variables that store the previous value instead of looking at the global memory. So we would be using the previous value here. But I am not sure that it would look any better. Well, the only way to know is to give it a try. All right, this is what it looks like with this change I'm proposing. We always start by updating our own sliders by reading the global memory. We always do that. Then we check against the previous value to determine whether we should call the slider function. And then we update the previous values for the next time we go around. We also need to set these variables up top. Just so we don't have glitches with computed values right as we load the plugin, because all the previous variables will be 0. And that made things a bit longer because there is a bit of busy work going on there, but we are only reading the gmem once. And reading gmem is expensive. It is more expensive than other things that we do. So I think that in terms of performance, this will pay off. It's not great. It's not terrible either. It is a pattern that we have already established in other places, and it is what it is. Let's see if this is still working, and also check on the performance just for the sake of it. Maybe we made it worse significantly. Are we still on 0.3? Well, it's 0.2 now, so if anything, we made it better. I don't think we made it better. In this instance, for whatever reason, always takes more CPU. I have no idea why. Because they both have to do almost the same work, but it seems like there's something about the sine wave that is causing denormals. I don't know. It's very tricky, very interesting. But hey, everything is still syncing. Great. What do you think of this last change? This last change I'm not so confident about. Do you like it or do you dislike it? Let me know. I'll keep it for now. Not as bad as Clojure and Haskell. That's enough to cause a stroke. I have not worked with Clojure all that much, but I have worked with different flavors of Lisp descendants, mostly Racket. I must admit, I love the parentheses. I know it's controversial. I stopped using parentheses because I think that the intent of a programming language is to communicate and express the ideas. And I think that if other people don't speak parentheses, then how are you going to communicate? Even if I believe that objectively the language is more precise and better, the point of the language is communication. So it's not to express something in the most beautiful way, it is to communicate that. That's why I stopped using descendants of Lisp. But I must admit, I really like the parentheses. Haskell, on the other hand, I don't know much about. The impression I get is that it's not for me. It's not for the kinds of problems that I like to work on. The type theory and everything is very interesting, but not the kind of language that I appreciate. Now, when it comes to syntax, Haskell has some nice ideas. It also has some ideas that I don't necessarily like, and it suffers from the same kind of problem because it takes so long for you to learn Haskell. It's so different, so out there. Then who are you communicating with, right? And that's why I like languages like JavaScript, Java, C++, languages that even if you don't like, you sort of understand as a programmer. But one thing that I do like about Haskell, for instance, is that you can have something like, I'm going to be butchering the syntax here because I don't remember Haskell all that well. But you can have something like I don't know, I will try to make an example that actually makes sense. So filter cut off filter coefficient. Suppose that you're doing a filter. Then you can do something like A0 times X0, A1 times X2, and so on. But you have not defined these variables yet. But then you can say something like where A0 is something and X0 is something. And in other languages, you would be forced to order this differently. You would be forced, for instance, in JSFX, we would be forced to do this in this order. The variables that depend, for instance, filter coefficient depends on these variables, needs to occur later. And there are many cases in which this is advantageous. You are communicating the concepts to someone, so you communicate this concept and then that concept and then this concept. And in some cases, it makes sense to build things up like this. But I do like having the option to sometimes express things like this, because in some contexts, it makes sense to explain things what I would call top-down. So you would give them a broad view and then go into the specifics. And depending on the context, the specifics are kind of understood and you don't even need to look at them. Or perhaps the shape is so beautiful, perhaps the shape communicates the idea so well that you want to see that high-level shape first. And in Haskell, as far as I understand, you have the option. Either way will work. But in most other languages, you have to write it this way. And this has, I guess, something to do with the way that mathematicians write things and even with the way that Haskell interprets things, the way that things are lazy and whatnot. But you could think of this as a purely syntactical problem. You could think of this where keyword as sort of the magical thing that binds every expression together. And then this whole thing becomes one big expression. So, and that's pretty much the same thing that occurs with the semicolon. That little punctuation, it's very humble, but it's so meaningful. It's doing so much. It's a sequencer operand. And we never think of it that way, but it is. It is an operation that we are doing with the semicolon. It's not just ending a line. It is sequencing, stringing operations together. So this is a different way of stringing the operations together, just in a different order to express top-down ideas instead of bottom-up ideas. And that's a little trick in Haskell that I don't remember many other languages having. Of course, you can implement a macro enclosure to do that. And I don't see many other languages that have this kind of concept. And I really like it. So there you go. That's a tangent. No one asked for, but you still have it anyway. The parentheses don't bother me, but I do get confused on and then when switching between JSFX and C++. True, yeah. They probably should have gone with the C++ thing, but also loop is so weird, right? It looks like a function call, but it's not. So who knows, maybe because of loop, the parenthesis is the way to delimit blocks. It certainly looks like they were trying to simplify their parser. They tried to simplify their parser by making these kinds of things. Because it looks like a function, the parser will follow the same path and the abstract syntax tree will be the same. Anyway, are we done with this refactoring today? Probably not. I think that there is something else that we can extract from this, some high-level concept that we can extract from this. And there is a bigger issue still, and that is when you save a project, close the project, and reopen the project, your sliders will be overwritten. We are overriding the parameters with the defaults every time. So the first time the first track loads, this block of code runs and overwrites your parameters with the defaults. That's bad. So there is still more work for us to do on this front, but I think that for today, we are ready to wrap up. This was a fun ride, and I think that we may continue working on this tomorrow. We'll see. I may take the day off. I don't think we are streaming with Arya over at IDDQD though, because I think that he's not available. Anyway, thank you Tail, Mage, and Bo for joining me here on the chat. It is always nice to have you here. And thank you to everyone else who is watching this too. I'm looking forward to seeing you all again, probably tomorrow, maybe on Monday, for more Automixer. Not sure exactly what on the Automixer. We may continue on this, but we may work on something else a little bit different. But more of the Automixer either tomorrow or on Monday. Thanks for stopping by. Thank you for watching the stream, you know how great it has been. Or maybe it sucked, and I am glad that you stuck with me. And soon we'll all be back together for some more coding or talking or chilling. The next time I'll be streaming.